Dieppe, France, August 19th, 1942. 06:30 hours. The morning tide is coming in fast across the pebbled beach, and through the pre-dawn darkness the outline of German gun emplacements becomes visible on the chalk cliffs above. Canadian soldiers wade through the surf, their uniforms darkening with seawater, their rifles held high. To the left and right, the cliffs tower almost perpendicular. 300 feet of fortified rock. It should be a massacre. But something extraordinary happens. Where there should be withering crossfire from the German defenders, there is instead an eerie silence. The reason is neither heroism nor luck, but rather a thick wall of white fog that materializes between the assault troops and the enemy gun positions. This fog is not natural. It has been manufactured, cultivated, and deployed with scientific precision across 5 kilometers of coastline. Within minutes, 200 smoke floats positioned offshore have released their chemical payload, transforming the English Channel into something resembling the opening of Dante's underworld. The Germans, trapped in their pillboxes with visibility reduced to mere meters, cannot see their targets. The psychological effect is devastating. A soldier cannot fight an enemy he cannot see, cannot shoot at a position shrouded in impenetrable haze. For the first time in modern warfare, Britain has turned the very air itself into a weapon of deception and protection, proving that sometimes the most effective military innovation is one that obscures rather than penetrates. This is the story of how Britain's scientists and engineers created an entire arsenal of smoke, transforming ordinary fog into a tool of war that would define operations from the Channel to the Rhine. The problem that smoke screens solved was one of the most intractable challenges of the Second World War: how to move large numbers of personnel, ships, and supplies across open ground or water while under enemy observation and fire. Throughout the 1930s and into the early stages of the war, Allied forces had suffered catastrophic losses precisely because they could not hide their movements. During the Battle of France in 1940, German air superiority meant that any concentration of troops or vehicles could be spotted from above and destroyed before it could maneuver into position. At sea, the situation was equally dire. Convoy after convoy of merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic was identified, tracked, and sunk by German U-boats, often with casualties exceeding 90% of the ships in a particular group. The Dieppe operation itself, planned for 1942, represented one of the first concerted Allied efforts to strike back at the German-occupied French coast. Intelligence suggested that the town held important radar installations and documents relating to German invasion plans. Yet, the very act of mounting such a raid meant assembling several thousand soldiers, transporting them across the Channel, and landing them on a heavily defended coast in broad daylight. Every conventional military calculation suggested it would fail. The beaches were fortified, the cliff-top positions bristled with machine guns, and German fighter aircraft could reach the location in minutes from bases inland. Previous amphibious operations had been bloodbaths. At Gallipoli in the First World War, poorly coordinated landings led to hundreds of thousands of casualties. The lessons seemed clear. You could not successfully conduct amphibious operations against prepared defenses without overwhelming firepower. Yet the British had neither the aircraft nor the naval guns to obliterate the German defenses beforehand. They had no answer to the fundamental problem: how to mask the approach of the invasion fleet and the landing troops. Existing solutions had proven wholly inadequate. Artillery smoke, generated by conventional smoke bombs, dissipated too quickly and was limited in range. Destroyers and gunboats could generate smoke, but only while stationary, and they would themselves become targets. The Royal Navy had experimented with chemical smoke generators, but these were temperamental, often failed to function correctly, and could not be reliably positioned or timed. What was needed was something revolutionary: a means of generating vast quantities of smoke, on demand, across multiple kilometers, that could be deployed from ships or from the shore, that could be synchronized with military operations, and that could be manufactured in sufficient quantities to mask multiple operations simultaneously. The answer came from an unlikely quarter: the Royal Dockyards at Shoebury-Ness on the Essex coast, where ordnance specialists and chemical engineers began experimenting with smoke generation in 1940. The facility, which had historically produced ammunition and explosives for the Royal Navy, was redirected towards developing smoke-generating equipment. A team led by engineers working under the direction of the Naval Ordnance Department developed what became known as the smoke float. This was a cylindrical metal container, approximately 2 meters in length and half a meter in diameter, weighing roughly 300 kilograms when fully loaded. The exterior resembled an artillery shell scaled up dramatically, complete with a pointed nose and fins for stability. Inside, the smoke float contained a mixture of chemicals, primarily titanium tetrachloride and sulfuric acid, which, when mixed in the presence of moisture from seawater, created a dense white smoke of remarkable opacity and persistence. The chemical reaction was exothermic but controlled, generating heat without explosion. The floats were fitted with simple fuses that could be set to detonate at a precise moment after the container struck the water, allowing operators to time the release of smoke across an entire area simultaneously. By 1942, the specification had been refined to an extraordinary degree. Each float could generate effective smoke coverage for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, obscuring an area equivalent to a small city block with visibility reduced to fewer than 20 meters. A single float, when properly deployed, could protect naval vessels or ground troops across a frontage of 150 meters. Critically, the smoke itself was non-toxic at the concentrations used operationally, though it was extremely irritating to eyes and respiratory passages at close range, which inadvertently added a psychological weapon to the arsenal. The manufacturing process was distributed across multiple sites. The metal containers themselves were produced at 3 separate facilities near Birmingham and Coventry, where existing shell-making machinery was repurposed for the task. The chemical fill was manufactured at Pontypool in South Wales, where surplus capacity in the synthetic explosives plants could be converted to smoke production. At its peak, British industry was producing 2,000 individual smoke floats per month, though exact figures remained classified and only historical estimates now survive. The assembly and quality testing occurred at Shoebury-Ness itself, where trained personnel handled the dangerous chemicals with procedures so strict that accident rates were remarkably low despite the inherent hazards. The innovation that set the British smoke float apart from German and American alternatives was the sophistication of the timing mechanism and the reliability of the chemical mixture. German smoke canisters, captured examples of which were examined by British ordnance specialists, used titanium tetrachloride but without the refined delivery system. American smoke screens, when deployed, relied more heavily on metal oxide compounds that produced less dense smoke and dissipated more rapidly. The British system, by contrast, produced smoke so thick and persistent that it essentially rendered all visual observation impossible. A German soldier attempting to observe the coastline through a smoke screen reported that the effect was akin to being inside a cloud, with visibility reduced to arm's length in all directions. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. We explore stories of British military innovation week after week, and your support allows us to continue researching and producing these documentaries. The first major operational deployment of smoke floats on a large scale was indeed the Dieppe raid of August 1942. The raid itself lasted only 9 hours, but the smoke screens were deployed for the critical first 40 minutes, the period during which the assault troops were most vulnerable to machine gun and artillery fire. Royal Navy minesweepers positioned offshore at dawn released 223 smoke floats in carefully coordinated salvos, creating a continuous barrier between the beach and the German defensive positions on the surrounding cliffs. The effect on the German garrison was immediate and profound. Messages captured after the war from German officers commanding the coastal defenses described the sudden onset of the smoke as causing complete disorientation and the inability to mount an effective response. One company commander reported that his men had fired blindly into the whiteness, having no targets visible. The smoke floats, however, could not overcome the fundamental problems of the Dieppe operation itself. The raid was undersupported, the withdrawal was not adequately covered by naval gunfire, and the Canadian soldiers, whilst briefly establishing positions in the town, were unable to hold them against German reinforcements. The operation resulted in approximately 3,600 casualties, of which roughly 2,000 were Canadian soldiers taken prisoner. Yet the smoke screens had performed their designated function flawlessly. Officers reviewing the operation concluded that without the smoke floats, the initial casualties during the beach landing would have been catastrophically higher. This lesson was not lost. Over the subsequent 2 years, smoke floats were deployed in numerous operations: the protection of convoy routes against air attack, the masking of amphibious training exercises in the run-up to D-Day, the obscuration of airfield movements, and the concealment of airfield construction sites. The 2nd Tactical Air Force, formed in 1943 specifically to support the eventual invasion of France, incorporated smoke screens as a standard element of operational planning. In the weeks before the Normandy landings, vast quantities of smoke floats were pre-positioned in ports along the south coast, whilst training exercises involving thousands of troops and hundreds of smoke floats took place along the Dorset and Hampshire coastlines. The psychological impact on the soldiers participating in these exercises was profound. The knowledge that they would be protected by an artificial fog, that the enemy could not see them as they approached fortified positions, transformed the morale of units preparing for the invasion. Letters home from soldiers described the smoke screens as eerie but reassuring, a sense that they were advancing under an umbrella of technological protection. The comparative analysis between British smoke systems and their German equivalents is instructive. The German Navy, under the direction of Admiral Raeder, had developed smoke-generating equipment for naval operations, primarily for the protection of capital ships such as the Tirpitz. However, these systems were designed for shipboard generation, with the smoke being produced through combustion of special chemicals within onboard generators. This approach was effective for tactical purposes. A capital ship could generate smoke rapidly to obscure its position from enemy warships, but it was unsuitable for amphibious operations. The smoke could not be pre-positioned, the timing could not be precisely controlled, and the quantities were insufficient for large-scale masking operations. The German Army, the Heer, had no comparable system for ground operations. German generals reviewing amphibious operations relied entirely on conventional artillery smoke and the speed of the assault to overcome defensive positions. This fundamental gap in German operational capability would prove significant during the defensive operations of 1944 and 1945. When American and British forces advanced inland from Normandy, they could and did use smoke screens to protect their movements across open ground, masking their intentions from German observation posts and artillery spotters. The Germans had no equivalent tool. They could see the smoke rising, could infer that a movement was taking place behind it, but could not counter it with smoke screens of their own. The American approach to smoke screens was pragmatic rather than innovative. The United States, possessing enormous industrial capacity, produced smoke generators based on designs initially developed by the British and refined through American manufacturing efficiency. American smoke floats were similar in principle to British versions, but tended to be slightly heavier and to use marginally different chemical compositions optimized for American production facilities and available raw materials. Where the Americans excelled was in volume and rapid distribution. By 1944, American factories were producing 5,000 smoke floats monthly, outpacing British production by a ratio of nearly 2.5 to 1. The American forces, therefore, used smoke screens with even greater profligacy than the British, deploying them not only for major amphibious operations but for routine river crossings and defensive positions. This abundance of smoke floats meant that American units often preferred sheer quantity to the precision timing that British operations emphasized. The impact of smokescreens on the course of the Second World War was significant, though often unquantifiable. The Dieppe raid, despite its overall failure as an operation, provided invaluable intelligence about the utility of smoke in amphibious operations. The lessons learned shaped the planning for Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion, where smokescreens were integrated into the assault plan from the outset. The D-Day landings themselves utilized smokescreens, though to a lesser extent than Dieppe, because the sheer volume of naval gunfire support available to the invasion fleet provided alternative means of suppressing German fire. Where smokescreens proved most consistently valuable was in the weeks and months following the Normandy landings, during the slow, grinding advance through Normandy and the breakout towards the Rhine. In the bocage terrain of the Norman countryside, smokescreens provided opportunities for assault troops to close with defensive positions without suffering the catastrophic casualties that such operations might otherwise have entailed. The British Second Army, under General Montgomery, became particularly adept at integrating smokescreens into tactical operations, using them to cover river crossings during the advance towards the Rhine. The Rhine crossing, in March 1945, when British and American forces conducted one of the largest amphibious operations of the war's later stages, relied heavily on smokescreens to protect the initial assault waves from German artillery and machine gun fire positioned on the far bank. Historical records indicate that smokescreens were deployed along virtually the entire crossing front, a distance of approximately 16 kilometers, involving the release of well over 1,000 smoke floats in coordinated salvos timed to coincide with the assault waves. German survivors of the Rhine crossing consistently reported that the smokescreens had rendered their defensive positions ineffective, that the inability to observe the crossing prevented them from concentrating fire on the assault troops. Surviving examples of British smoke floats can be found today in military museums and historical collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds several intact floats with their original chemical fill removed. The D-Day Museum in Portsmouth preserves documentation relating to smokescreen operations during the Normandy campaign. The Finnish Army, operating as a co-belligerent with Germany, captured British smoke floats during operations on the Eastern Front and subsequently analyzed them, though they were never able to replicate the precision and reliability of the British design. After the war, smoke float technology became a standard component of amphibious doctrine for both NATO forces and, later, American expeditionary operations. The basic principles established by British engineers in 1940 remain recognizable in modern smoke-generating equipment used by contemporary armed forces, though modern systems employ more sophisticated chemicals, electronic timing mechanisms, and are increasingly integrated with electronic warfare systems. The smoke float represents a particular species of military innovation, one concerned not with destruction but with concealment, not with penetrating enemy defenses but with obscuring one's own movements. In an era when military technological development was synonymous with the creation of ever more destructive weapons, tanks with thicker armor, aircraft with greater speed and firepower, naval vessels with heavier guns, the British investment in smokescreens represents a counterintuitive choice. And yet it was a choice born of necessity and rational calculation. Faced with an enemy that possessed operational superiority in every conventional measure, the British recognized that the solution lay not in matching German firepower but in rendering that firepower ineffective through simple, elegant obscuration. The Dieppe raid, despite its ultimate failure, provided the proof of concept. The subsequent refinement and deployment of smoke floats across the European theater from 1943 onwards established the technology as a vital component of Allied military capability. When American and British forces finally crossed the Rhine in March 1945, and when they subsequently advanced into the heart of Germany, they did so with the knowledge that smokescreens could be called upon to protect critical operations, that this artificial fog could be conjured on demand to render enemy observation impossible and turn the tide of battle. The innovation required no revolutionary scientific principle, no deployment of secret weapons or exotic materials. It required instead the application of existing chemical knowledge, the careful refinement of manufacturing processes, and the willingness to recognize that sometimes the most effective military response to the enemy is not to shoot harder, but to make oneself invisible. In the white fog that rose from the smoke floats off Dieppe in August 1942, there was no thunder of artillery, no chatter of machine gun fire, no roar of aircraft engines. There was only the chemical whisper of titanium tetrachloride meeting moisture in the air, the soft hiss of millions of tiny particles of smoke spreading across the water, and within that obscuring haze, the sound of soldiers moving forward, protected by an innovation so simple and so effective that it would become a standard element of military doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The smoke that rose that morning was not merely the product of chemistry. It was the materialization of a principle, that in modern warfare, what the enemy cannot see cannot kill you. That principle, established in a chemical reaction on a summer morning in 1942, would echo through every amphibious operation the Allies conducted for the remainder of the war, and indeed would persist in military planning and doctrine for generations to come. The great obscuration had begun, and it would not fully lift until the war itself was at an end.